Welcome to the Young Indy Chroniclers, a podcast about the making of the show The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which first aired on ABC in 1992.
Kept thinking about what was Indiana Jones like as a young man. I came up with this idea of him seeing the world through the eyes of a soldier and a secret agent.
Over the course of our podcast, we're going to talk to a whole host of very talented people who either worked on this show or were there from the beginning.
We were able to shoot it on location in the real places where these events took place.
Oh, make it up as you go. Oh boy, that's great advice.
We hired some of the best European directors, a whole host of very, very talented people.
I'm your host, Peter Holmstrom.
And I'm Daniel Noah, and this is the Young Indy Chroniclers.
There's only one rule, Indiana. Stay alive.
Welcome back to the Young Indy Chroniclers, a podcast devoted specifically to the Young Indiana Jones television series and franchise. I'm your host, Peter Holmstrom, and with me, as always, on this journey of a lifetime is Mr. Daniel Noah.
Hello there.
When looking at Young Indiana Jones, more so than perhaps any other show I've ever watched, the series is an anthology. Not only do the casts and characters and situations shift from week to week, but the tone does as well. You can have the most dour examination of the horrors of war one week and have a farcical comedy the next. On today's show, we have the writer who, in many ways, wrote the goalposts episodes for the series, with Petrograd on one end, which is the tale of a failed Bolshevik revolution, and on the other goalpost with Prague 1917, which is an outright comedy in the vein of a Buster Keaton movie. Our guest has also written a number of movies such as Small Soldiers and Absolutely Anything in 2015, as well as being a successful novelist. Gavin Scott is joining us today. Thank you so much for being here.
It's a great pleasure to speak to you, Peter, and you, Daniel.
You know, before we even get to Young Indy, I'd love just to ask a bit about yourself, a bit about your history, how you first got involved with screenwriting.
The first half of my career was essentially as a journalist.
Good morning, you're with Central and the morning news now with Gavin Scott.
Good morning and welcome to the morning news from ITN on Saturday, 15th July. It's 5 o'clock. At the Summit of World Leaders in Paris, there's been a spectacular display to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the fall of the Bastille.
My family emigrated from England to New Zealand in 1961. So for the first 10 years of my life, I was a little kid in an industrial city in the north of England, the city of Hull. Still pretty knocked about from bomb damage during the war. Then in 1961, my family emigrated to New Zealand, and I found myself growing up in a wonderful rural environment in an area called Hawke's Bay, full of apple orchards and fruit farms and just beautiful and Mediterranean climate. Oddly enough, it looked very similar with the sort of golden tussock grass and the little clumps of trees to Marin County. So when I went to work on the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, suddenly I felt enormously at home. Anyway, I'm digressing slightly, but so the second half of my childhood was growing up in New Zealand. When I went to university, I got married while I was at university, and my fiancée at the time, her mother was quite a famous New Zealand journalist, and she gave me permission to marry her daughter at a fairly young age, because we were only 20 at the time, provided I knew how to write a leading paragraph and had some idea of the laws of libel. She ran the National School of Journalism, and Wow. Nicola, my wife, and I both commuted from university during our last year at college down to the Polytechnic to take a diploma in journalism. And we both began broadcast journalism as soon as we graduated. So in the early 70s, I was a journalist with the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation. That led, after a couple of years, we both felt we wanted to check out the big time. And we traveled for 3 months across Asia, through places you can't go to so easily these days, like Afghanistan and Iran and so on. We traveled across Asia to Britain, and eventually we both found work with, in my case, the Times newspapers, and in my wife's case, in film editing. And from the Times, from being a newspaper reporter, I became a radio reporter with the BBC, and sometimes an anchor as well. Moved on to television and basically spent 20 years as a journalist. If if you want to ask, perhaps I should give you a chance to ask a question, but the first half of my career is essentially journalism until the late 90s. But if you want to ask how I got from journalism into screenwriting.
How did you get from journalism to screenwriting?
Excellent question. I'm glad you asked that. Essentially, I hugely enjoyed the films and documentaries I was making, and for television journalism, I kind of expanded from being an on-the-road reporter to making documentaries and sort of 10-minute films and 15-minute films. I really enjoyed that, and so I decided to try writing a screenplay. And my first introduction to how you did that was getting a paperback copy of William Goldman's script for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which, if ever you get a chance to read it, I really recommend it. It's almost like a novel, even though it's screenplay format. He talks to you as if you're the reader of a novel, and so I thought that's how you wrote screenplays. So I wrote a number, and I got optioned by some people like Dick Lester, who made Superman and Hard Day's Night and so on, optioned one of my scripts about Jules Verne, and he wasn't able to make it in the end, although it did come to fruition later on. But essentially that gave me a bit of confidence, and I decided that I could either be a journalist who wrote screenplays in his spare time, or I could take a leap and say I'm a screenwriter now. And I consulted with my wife and our 3 little girls and pointed out this is a risky thing. But I was coming up to age 40, and I felt it was time to make a change. And I had an agent by this time in England, Linda Seifert, and I went to her and said, "So Linda, I've decided to resign from my job at IT Independent Television News, was where I was working at that time. And from now on, what will support my wife and family and mortgage will be what work you're able to get me." She looked a bit green about the gills, and said, "Okay, are you sure?" And I said, "Yep, it's what I want to do. Is there anything going on?" And she said, "Well, George Lucas is coming to London to recruit writers for a series he wants to make about the young Indiana Jones." I said, "That sounds fantastic. What have you sent him?" And she said, "I've sent him your resume." I said, "Well, that's not going to impress him very much because I haven't had anything produced. I've been a journalist. Send him a script. Send him the Jules Verne script that I wrote." And she said, "No, the problem is they said they don't want to see any scripts." Now, 24 hours before, I would have said, "Okay, those are the rules, send in the resume." But now I really had resigned from my job. I had gone in to see my editor and said, "I'm resigning." And so I therefore said to Linda, "Send in the script." And she said, "That might mean you don't get considered at all." And I said, "I'll take that chance." Within about a week, I got an opportunity to meet with George at I think the St. James's Club in London. I'd done a bit of research in the meantime, and the research that I'd done was basically about who might have inspired Indiana Jones to become Indiana Jones. Now, I knew that in the 1930s, he was in his 30s, so therefore he would have been, according to the movie, the first movie, therefore he would have been born around 1900. Who around 1900? Well, it could have inspired him. And now, obviously, it wouldn't have been literally in 1900 when he was a baby, but when he was about 10, because I knew that the first Young Indy was about 10, next one would be about 17. Who at 10 years old could have inspired him? What was happening in 1910? I knew his father by this stage. We all knew that his father was an archaeologist. So his father might have gone to the Middle East with him. If he had taken Young Indy to the Middle East, he might have met someone who at that time was an archaeologist and a spy. And that was Thomas Edward Lawrence.
It was my privilege to know him and to make him known to the world. He was a poet, a scholar, and a mighty warrior.
Not yet Lawrence of Arabia. Wasn't famous yet at all until World War I happened. But he was an adventurer. He spoke Arabic. He lived with the people. He blended with the native population, and he understood the past. And I thought, a 10-year-old boy meeting the young Lawrence of Arabia, what better concept could he have had of who he might become than Indiana Jones?
Why are there no artifacts? Maybe they were stolen?
I don't think so. The door seals were intact. There must be another chamber.
So that's what I put to George. George was fascinated. And he said, "Oh, I didn't know any of this. How did you know this?" And I told him a bit about my historical background, because I've always been fascinated by history. And I think that was what swung it. Anyway, at the end of the meeting, they said, as they always do, "Well, don't call us, we'll call you." Very politely, but essentially that. And so actually we went on holiday to France with my family. We were in a little cottage near Cahors in France. And about 2 weeks later, the phone rang, and basically a voice at the other end said, "How soon can you get over to Skywalker Ranch?"
Wow.
Which was music to my ears, as you can imagine.
Wow. Wild. So, like, you had such a career before that, but essentially your first big foray into the world of screenwriting was with George Lucas, and at the time one of the biggest projects out there, and that's just remarkable.
It was wonderful.
Well, and your pitch makes it into the show. I mean, that's such a huge part of the narrative, was not only the inspiration, but that relationship between him and Lawrence of Arabia, and the letter writing that kind of runs throughout. And what a great claim that you can make on that. It's fantastic.
I was very fortunate, and it has always been my method when writing novels or screenplays or anything. I love working off the facts. That I suppose that's my journalistic background, that you've got to get it right. You've got to actually know the facts before your imagination can take wing. And so it definitely came out of kind of who I am as a creative person.
The research is half the fun. And I feel like, for George especially, your background in documentary films must have been very important, because he talks about how much, he not only does he love experimental films, but he has a lot of background in documentary work
Absolutely.
as well. So I'm sure that you were just, the kindred spirit in a lot of ways.
I can't tell you how wonderful it was working with him. I mean, with all the writers, sitting up in that marvelous office of his at Skywalker Ranch, looking out over the ranch, and with highly stimulating people, and George masterminding it. I mean, you probably, if you've talked to people like Matthew, he probably has talked about the brainstorming process, whereby George encourages all to throw in ideas, just without censorship, which is the key thing in brainstorming. I think some people didn't get that immediately. They felt that if there was an idea someone had put up that wasn't very good, they should shoot it down, which is not the idea. And George never did. He took the notes. He literally sat there and wrote up what we were saying as we were saying it. And about every 20 minutes, he summed up. And it was brilliant. The ideas that he didn't like never got mentioned again, and the ones that he did get in. But he didn't hurt anybody's feelings. You know what I mean? He just picked up the things that had appealed to him, and then we built on that, which was a masterclass in how to manage a creative group.
That's wonderful to hear. Do you recall just what was one of the craziest ideas that got thrown out that was entertained for a little while?
I probably don't. No, I don't think I'm sure plenty of them were mine. I do remember one phrase that there were times when we all got very giggly. And I do remember a time when it was one of the more supernatural episodes, and somebody, probably me, suggested that Indy might step in the puddle of evil, which made everybody laugh, and moved us on to somewhere else. You know what I mean?
You carry death in your pocket.
It definitely is in the category of the Dial of Destiny and all those slightly absurd things. But no, as I say, it was a process whereby we gradually built on. We did one act at a time, which was a good discipline, and we nearly always I would say we broke for, we started at, I think, 9. We broke for lunch. We carried on in the afternoon. Usually by about 3 o'clock, we were stuck. We'd done 3 acts, and quite frequently we didn't know what to do next. There were 2 solutions that George had for this. One, he would inquire because people used Skywalker Ranch for, he would not host conferences, but people came for meetings and things there, not to do with the Indiana Jones project, but he hosted them. And he would usually inquire what cookies they were being served. And if he liked the sound of them, he'd say, well, bring some of them up here. So that was usually chocolate was involved. That was one of the ways of dealing with the being stuck. But the other way was absolute genius, and I've used it since. He would say, well, where do we want to end up at the end of this episode? What has got to happen? Where has Indy got to be? Where has each character got to be? The bad guy? Where has the MacGuffin got to be? And then we'd work backwards from that point. We knew where we wanted to be at the end. We only, by that stage, usually had one act to deal with. So it wasn't like going backwards to the whole thing. But you'd find that in order to achieve that, you had to do that and suddenly the last act was done. Again, in terms of a masterclass in how to deal with the creative process, he was giving it to us every day.
Absolutely. I love that.
How big were those sessions, and how long did they last? Like, how long did they go on for? How many weeks or months?
Well, in terms of individual sessions, basically we did one episode per day. And the night before, we were staying in the writer's house at Skywalker Ranch, which is a beautiful, beautiful environment. And George creates beautiful environments, and where we were living was wonderful. And we would be given a large package of research. Now, George, I think, had actually, at one point, the Paramount, I believe, had been selling off their research department, and George had bought it, the library, and I think he'd actually hired the people who were the researchers too. Wonderful people. Wow. And they came up to the ranch with him. So when he wanted to know about Petrograd or Barcelona or wherever, he had all that information. It was all copied and provided us with a big stack of pages the night before. We'd study them. We came in, and as I say, the process was working act by act, brainstorming. And at the end of we didn't get to go home until we'd finished an episode, but usually we managed to finish the outline for an episode, about 5 or 6 o'clock, which wasn't too bad at all. Now, if I recall rightly, the first time we did this, it was perhaps 2 weeks. We came to Skywalker Ranch for 2 weeks. There were certain times when we were there for 3 weeks or something. But essentially, we did this for 2 weeks until we had X number of episodes. Then they were divided among the writers. You can do these two or whatever. And then we went away and wrote them. And then we came back together to edit them. And George was involved in that process. So it was collective brainstorming, individual writing, collective editing. And sometimes that took place in London, sometimes that took place at the ranch.
I almost wonder, and I would love to dig into this, it feels like in television at that time, that may have been a pretty unique situation. I don't know that a lot of TV was being written that way in the early 90s and late 80s.
You may well be right. And of course, from my point of view, because I was new to the business, this was my first gig, this is how it's done. I thought, I got an opportunity to do it myself when later on I made a series of my own called The Secret Adventures of Jules Verne, and I pretty much copied what I'd learned from George. But because I thought that was how you did it, and it worked reasonably well. But it certainly worked wonderfully with the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. The whole process was a pleasure from start to finish.
Do you recall, because it was such an anthology-based show, and I believe there was, as you said, there was like 9 or 15 episodes in that first story break session. How did you even attack that from a conceptual standpoint? Because you're having to hop around so much in terms of Indy and his own life. What was it taken chronologically, or was it just like episode 1, episode 2?
I can't remember. I literally can't remember whether it was taken chronologically or not. But of course, from my point of view, I'd been used as a journalist, to go in and, I would either come up with an idea of my own for that day's story or be given an assignment. And sometimes I was working on a news show which had a noon, 1 o'clock session and a 5 o'clock session. So I'd be doing 2 or 3 stories a day. And that was kind of my modus operandi anyway. So it wasn't really a challenge from that point of view. Plus, as I say, we had this wonderful basis of the masses of research that Georgia did. So if we were doing Indy age 10 in Africa, or if we were doing Indy age 17 in Petrograd, we had all the information that we needed from his research department, at our fingertips, which was bliss.
It's one of the ongoing question marks for us doing this podcast is we look at the show now in its finalized, edited format, And we kind of can see a certain arc of the series. And, Matthew Jacobs talked about how like the young Indy, with Corey Carrier, the toddler, his is much of an innocent kid exposed to the world for the first time. And then when it comes to the teenage Indy, it's much more about a loss of innocence kind of arc. He's going from a place of eager enthusiasm about war to a place of being like, war is horrible, and to almost like becoming the jaded hero that we see in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Do you have any recollection of was there a certain philosophy going into the writing of specific episodes, or was it purely, we're writing the best episode we can? We'll figure out, the theme will be figured out by critics years later and podcasters with too much time on their hands.
I don't recall us. No, I could be wrong, and I'm prepared to be corrected, but I don't recall us talking much about Indy's character arc. And I'll tell you why I don't think it was necessary. Not because it hadn't been thought of, but because of the fact that George was guiding the process. And I think who Indy was in each episode reflected George's own view of his own personal development and his own philosophy of the world.
But sometimes taking life is inevitable. To eat, I have to hunt. To survive a leopard's attack, I have to shoot it.
I think it's much safer right here in your bed.
I thought you was with that writer. What's his name?
Yeah, his name is Tony. She's with him right now.
So you was setting to steal his woman, huh?
No,
Sounds like it to me.
So it didn't need, it didn't need us to say, well, what is Indy really thinking? Because I think George knew what Indy was really thinking, because there's a lot of Indiana Jones is George. In some ways, of course, he's not. But in many ways, the truth of the personality, I think, comes from the fact that George understands Indy and is Indy in many ways. So we were kind of able to ride that wave, I think.
Yeah, my father was very firm, and he was very, my mother was actually ill a lot, so I was raised a lot by my father. I started out with a girlfriend around the 6th grade, and
how was
had
that?
my heart broken.
Really?
Yeah, but it was one of those fun things in the 6th and 7th grade, where it's
To have your heart broken?
fanciful kind of puppy dog, silly kind of love.
That's really interesting, because it's something I've thought watching it, is because some of these themes recur and some of these sort of relationship dynamics recur, it does seem very personal, and you sense an author behind it. When you read an author's works and you know their style and you know some of the things that they do, it really does feel like George Lucas himself is throughout the series. Would you say that was your observation at the time?
Yeah, very much. I mean, that it was in some ways, sitting in that room with George was it was him exploring life through these events in history. It was him looking at the world at his own development, but using Indiana Jones as his alter ego. So yeah, absolutely. And that's also what, I mean, one of the things I want to say is that he clearly hugely enjoyed it. I think it's fair to say that George is not someone he's not one of these hail fellow, well-met people, who goes out slapping people on the back and going up to total strangers. And whether shy is putting it too strongly, I'm not sure, but he's certainly a very sincere and straightforward person. Having said that, in the meeting, the great thing was we got to know each other. Over those weeks of intense creative work, and over those years that it spread, we all got to know each other, and I think he enjoyed our company. We certainly enjoyed his, but we felt that he opened up, that he was able to be frank with us, that he was able to be, sort of skittish and fun, and recall things and tell us stories. I think he enjoyed that as much as we did, and that in some ways that joie de vivre comes over into the show.
First there was the sunrise, and then there was your face. And I loved the sunrise, but I loved your face better. You got that? All right. The sunrise made me see your lovely face clearly, and it was good, like yellow Frascati.
Yellow for Scotty?
And it was good.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a very, I think it has a lot of joy and a lot of enthusiasm, just sort of in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always say it lacks the cynicism that I think television's just drowning in right now, and movies too. But like, we look back on the show, and even when it's very dark, it can get very dark. I mean, one of your episodes is a very dark episode.
What about the Cossacks?
What about the Cossacks?
The Cossacks have come out in favor of the government. There's snipers on the rooftops all along the main roads.
How do we know you're telling the truth?
Because I'm your friend.
And yet, even within that episode, there's just like a lack of cynicism to it, which I appreciate so much.
Well, I know that one of the motivations George had in the whole creation of the series was his concern that American education wasn't teaching kids about history. And I think it's sadly, I don't think the situation has changed. And if you don't understand the past, then you don't understand the present, and you can't plan the future properly. And he wanted the series to give its audience something so that they ended up coming away with some understanding of what had happened. Not a list of facts and figures, but just some understanding of how things had come to be.
Now, ask yourself this. Have you ever heard of a revolution starting when the leader was on holiday?
That is not the only reason why the Bolsheviks are not making the move now. It's much more basic than that. Russia isn't ready.
And that worked against any possibility of cynicism, because there was a real goal to the whole thing that we all felt inspired by. That we wanted to have fun, we wanted to have adventure, we wanted to have, suspense, but we knew that if we got our task done correctly, then audiences would come away with a bit of more understanding of the world than they had when they began.
You see, Spain is neutral.
Right, neutral.
The Germans, naturalmente, want her to come in on their side. While we are determined that she comes in on ours.
Yeah, I think especially to the education point, it's like, I really don't remember learning much about World War I in school. Like, there was plenty of talk about World War II, but like World War I almost nothing. And what I love about this series and about the documentary specials that accompany the DVD set is it becomes really clear that World War I and the events of that era that you guys were writing about was truly some of the most important events of modern history. Mm-hmm. That we're still feeling the ramifications of the events of this 10-year period still to this day. And it's just shocking that we still look back on the series as being like such a learning opportunity for people that it's not being addressed in the school system.
No, I mean, that's one good thing about creating it, the fact that you can get it on DVD. It wasn't lost. We created something, and it's still there. It's still available to kids, and whether it's available to teachers. If they want to use it as a starting point, individual episodes, a starting point for lessons, it's there and possible.
Well, can I ask you a bit about one piece of actual lost media from the Young Indy series? We haven't actually had a chance to talk to anyone about the old Indy bookends, which are no longer part of the series themselves. Do you recall anything about like what George was trying to accomplish with these old Indy bookends, and what was your own process like of writing this character as a 93-year-old in what was then modern day?
Yeah, good question. It's kind of slipped out of my mind in a way.
That's fair.
As George Lucas probably would have wanted, considering he cut them out.
Yeah, because I remember seeing the actor. Oh, he's doing a good job and so on. But it wasn't like part of our. It wasn't really creating those bookends. Was not really a crucial part of the creative process for us. It was getting the story right in itself. Sure. I'll be honest with you. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, speaking with story, I want to talk about the 3 episodes that you wrote, but there is, at least on Wikipedia, it says that there's an episode that you wrote called Berlin 1916, I believe, that was never produced. Is that true? I guess first question, is that claim on the internet even real? And then I would love to ask you what that was about, if it was true.
I would love to know as well. It is quite possible, because there were several episodes that were written that were not shot, and I've honestly forgotten, so I can't give you an honest answer to that. Although I know that some were made. But here's one of the things that I feel a creative investment in all the episodes, because of the fact we all collectively made them up. So even the ones that I didn't get to write, I mean, Jonathan Hale obviously got to write the introductory episode quite appropriately because he was a much more experienced writer than I was. But as I say, that concept of Young Indy meeting Lawrence of Arabia came from me. But I was more than happy for a writer as skilled as Jonathan to realize it. But at the same time, I feel, well, that's my work as well, you know.
Absolutely,
as we all of us who are writing it, I think, can legitimately say we each of us had something to contribute to every episode that was shot. So some were made and vanished and written and never shot, and some were shot and forgotten about and so on.
Well, I think if it was made today, you would be listed. All of you would be listed as producers. It's typically how TV is done today, right? Where if you're all writing the show together, you'd have that credit on every episode, even if you don't have the screenplay credit. So that's something that wasn't going on back then, unfortunately.
No. But it was, as I say, that being able to work with George Lucas made up for so much. And one story you might be interested in, which I'd love to tell, is how the involvement of Terry Jones of Monty Python in this.
Yeah, please.
Because I remember I was back in London and I got a call from George saying, I want Terry Jones to direct your episode, the one set in Barcelona. And he says he's too busy. Will you get him for me? Now, he was speaking to someone who had, been in the business just for a matter of months, really. But I went along to see. So I called Terry and said, George Lucas had asked me, so I was not going to say, well, I don't think I can do that. So I went along to see Terry Jones. He lived in Camberwell in South London at that time. And he was very polite, very courteous, and said, well, the problem was that he had another script for a movie that he'd been writing, that he had been working on. And he'd set aside the next 3 months to rewrite it and get it ready. And again, being naive and new to the business, I thought, oh, would you like me to do it for you? And he said, well, have a look at it if you like. So anyway, he gave me the script, and I spent the next 10 days rewriting it. And took it along to him, and he said, I really like this. This is very good. So I said, well, will you do the Young Indiana Jones thing then? And he agreed to direct that. Now, he and I then became both friends and writing partners over the years, writing different series, including animated series, and as you mentioned earlier on, the movie Absolutely Anything. And he became a great friend of our family. Our kids knew each other, and it was a wonderful relationship that came from that. But it was initiated by George Lucas saying, go get me Terry Jones. And managed it.
That's fantastic.
I absolutely love that. Can you talk a bit about, were you able to be on set for that? I imagine you weren't. You
can imagine I was, and indeed the proof is in the pudding, and that I'm in the movie. I'm one of the German spies. Yeah. No, I don't expect, and it's not something, oh, you should have known that, because I'm pretty obscure. I don't have much to say. But it was.
But you have a credits. I remember seeing the credits in there.
And it was wonderful fun. I mean, getting my hair cut in a Germanic fashion, and being in Prague, where so much was shot, and then being in Barcelona, where, the second half of it, and also being with people like Timothy Spall. Wonderful. I mean, what a cast. The Ken Cranham, Timothy Spall. There was Timothy Spall. I remember there was a lovely moment when, before we started shooting, Terry and I were up at the castle in Prague, just looking at the pictures, because there's amazing art up there. And there was quotes, I say this in heavy quotes, a little old lady looking at the pictures as well. And she turned to us and said, oh, thank goodness it's you. She said, I'm in the episode. I'm one of the actresses, and I was enjoying the pictures and worrying that I might have got the date wrong and I was supposed to be on set. But if the director is here, I know I'm in the right place. Now, Liz Smith, wonderful actress. She did usually play little old ladies. She wasn't, of course, quite as little or old as she appeared on screen, but that was her persona. But it was lovely, the very great pleasure that she had in realizing that, having confirmation that she hadn't got the time wrong to be on set. And there was another time when Terry and I were kind of cruising the bars. Just gives you the wrong impression. But we were having a drink in a bar in Prague, and I glanced along, and there was like Havel, the president of Czechoslovakia, as it then was, not yet.
Wow.
And the president of Mexico, who was visiting for some reason, and they were having a drink together at the bar. And I thought, this is pretty cool. I'm here with Terry Jones of Monty Python, with the president of Mexico and the president of the Czechoslovakia, all having a drink. And I thought, yeah, that's this is. I'm glad. Oh, journalism was fun, but this is even more fun.
Well, since you were on set, how long did an episode shoot for? Was it a week or was it longer than that? How long were you there?
I'm trying to think. I think we had a couple of weeks. I do remember the budget. The budget was $1.5 million, which is amazing. That they got done, for that. I mean, Rick, the producer, was brilliant at saving money. In fact, George knows how to make a dime go a long way as well. And one of the things we did was he bought up the unused footage from various action films, and we constructed our action sequences around them. There was one from the movie The Old Gringo, as I recall, which starred Gregory Peck, which had the train going into the walls of a fortified city, and George had bought up the unused footage, which would have been far beyond our budget. But once he got that, then he could build the story around it, and we shot around it. So they really made their money go a long way. I mean, the fact that we went to Africa, for episodes set in Africa, went to Africa, went to St. Petersburg, it was extraordinarily well produced by Rick and George together.
I think that's part of the thing we keep coming back to with the series is just how global it is. Every episode is a different location, and the ability to do that. Even the big budget shows today, the Game of Thrones, whatever. It's like they might go to like 3 or 4 different countries, but then that's it, and that's where they're at. They have their setups, but it was week after week. It was a different location, and we hope we can get some of the producers on at some point, because I'm sure it was a logistical nightmare, but it was makes for a very interesting show.
It, because Rick is a good storyteller, and I'm sure will not hold back in telling you wonderfully scurrilous details of how things were achieved.
Oh, that's I want to hear that story.
Yeah.
We'll do a multi-part Rick McCallum saga on this.
Rick McCallum is a must. Yes, very much so.
You talked a little bit earlier about how each of you felt like you were contributing to each of the scripts. I wonder if you could talk a bit about, like, if you have it in your mind, like, what were those things? Like, what was did you feel like you each had a certain set of skills that you were bringing to the table, or was it very much like you're all kind of on the same page, you're all talented writers and all contributing?
Yeah, good question. You see, we all had to talk about everything. That is to say, because we were creating the story beat by beat and act by act, we all needed to be able to contribute character notes, historical notes, good action sequences, surprises. So I wouldn't say that there was one person we always turned to for the X or the Y. We all threw ourselves into that. But having people like Rosemary Ann Sissons there, who represented an older generation and had this wonderful track record of things like the Six Wives of Henry VIII and so on, as well as things like not early Disney, but 60s Disney films. So she had a feminine point of view, which was really worth, working into this, and Jules as well. It was good that we weren't all guys, because it was good to be reminded of the human and emotional element of people's lives, as well as the exciting action stuff. But Jules and Rosemary it was very valuable to have their input in the room.
And I know sadly Rosemary has passed, but do you have any memories of her, in the room? Maybe comments that she made, I think you said, just because we obviously are not able to ask her ourselves.
My main memory would be that she, I think, gave us kind of emotional ballast to the thing, especially in the love relationship. You know what I mean? That she wasn't going to let us skate over the relationship elements in our excitement, in our lust for exciting action. She wanted to make sure it was emotionally grounded, and she and Jules both did that. And she was a sweet person, and she, as I say, because she was significantly older, she was able to bring into play memories and stories going back to World War II. She gave us an extra perspective of a historical perspective, which was very valuable, as well as the emotional one. And also she had great experience as a writer. It was a delight. I mean, George, I think, chose very well. I mean, he may have taken a chance on me, and may have thought occasionally, "Oh my God, what have I got myself? What have I got myself with this crazy Englishman?" But the galaxy of writing talent that he had in that room, interacting as it did over years, was a brilliant creation in itself.
Well, I think, like, looking at some of the other shows that George produced, the Clone Wars comes to mind. You could see that some writers don't stick around, and yet it seems like with Young Indy, it's like the first hires stayed through the run. So obviously, you all did a great job.
Well, thank you. And it was also the fact it was a great place to be. George was a great person to be with. Skywalker Ranch was a wonderful place to be, and then the locations that we went to, were, I mean, Prague, Barcelona, etc., etc. You think, gosh, it's great to be here. Especially great to be here when you get directors like Terry's or Simon Windsor and the talented actors that they brought in. I mean, it's like a family party that gets better as it goes on, as richer and richer characters add to it. So no one was going to walk away from that.
Were you able to be on set for any of the other episodes besides Barcelona?
Barcelona was the chief one that I was present for. That's the one partly because I was in it, that I really I enjoyed it most. And also that I mean in Barcelona, that wonderful moment when they drove into the bullfighting arena, smashing their way into that. I mean, we had a real bullfight. You could still smell the blood in the sawdust. In a real bullfighting arena, and there they smashed their way in, and then having Terry Jones play a role, as well. I mean,
that was great.
Those memories completely stick with you.
I wanted to ask about the Petrograd episode. It's definitely, of the three you wrote the screenplays for, the most serious, and particularly the ending. Has always stuck with me. It's a bold choice to end with I believe it's the Cossacks shooting the sort of the protesters, in the street. Yeah. And this episode, I guess it would have aired in 92 or 93, but I kept thinking about, Tiananmen Square. Was that something that you guys maybe talked about as you were talking about the episode? Were you reflecting on any current events?
That's a good point. And I'll be honest with you, I don't recall discussions of that. In terms of what was happening when we were writing it, this, oddly enough, my last assignment as a journalist was the fall of the Berlin Wall. Literally, I'd been there on the night. It wasn't just to be clear, the Berlin Wall opened before it fell. It didn't, you've got the images of people with hammers knocking it down. That did happen. But the night that the Berlin Wall really fell, I was there for, and it was people pouring through the gates with their shopping bags to buy the things that they hadn't been able to buy for decades. And suddenly they could walk around West Berlin, marveling at everything they'd been cut off from. And I was there with a group of reporters and went back with the family to East Berlin and so on. So that was the world we were living in when we were writing the show. It was actually the world opening up. All the good things seemed to be happening. It didn't last, but there was a feeling of optimism and of possibility at that time. And that, I think, did feed into... And so in all honesty, to answer your question directly, the Cossacks shooting the people down, I don't think it came from a place of pessimism at that time. And we might have been more prescient had that been the case, but that was not where we were coming from.
Yeah,
we seem to be turning a corner in the world. We turned a few corners since.
Can I ask you a bit more about that episode? Because I watch it And many of the episodes of Young Indy often feel like you're coming in the middle of an already existing story. That there may be some of them, we know were intended to be filled in later. There was going to be, episodes of Indy in basic training or things like that we just unfortunately never got to see. But with Petrograd, it really feels like we're coming in like, in some ways, the third act of a story. Indy has friends that he's referring to as old friends.
Come along, old friend. Let's get you home, huh?
Come on, Irene. We have an agreement, don't we? You don't ask me what goes on at the French embassy. I don't ask you what goes on at Bolshevik headquarters.
He has this group of people that, this woman's already madly in love with him and has been harboring this affection for seemingly a long time.
Rosa, have you been waiting here for me? Why?
Because I love you. I shouldn't be saying this, should I? I'm embarrassing you.
No. It's just...
You don't need to say anything. I got it wrong, didn't I?
Rosa, I like you so much. But love is a weird thing. It's kind of like lightning. And you can no more make it strike than you can stop it if it decides to hit you.
And you haven't been struck.
Do you recall, was there ever a thought of adding to that story, showing the beginning of that? Or was this just a sense of, this is kind of how we're writing the show? We're writing the show, anthology-based format. You're in the middle of an episode and we're going.
Odd enough, it was slightly the other way around. I always wanted to pick it up after that, because after all, that was the kind of abortive revolution, and then it, Lenin and the communists, the Bolsheviks, made another move which had a completely different set of consequences, and I always felt it would be good to follow Indy through those other events which were to come, but sadly that possibility wasn't there. But yeah, you're right. I mean, we moved in there. Indy is well established. Young Indy is well established at the beginning of that episode. He's got this gang of friends, and that's definitely something that we wanted to achieve. We wanted him to feel part of a group. That he has established himself somewhere, that he's comfortable, and then events are going to throw a spanner in the works. So that's one of the reasons that we kicked off with him being surrounded by people who know him, comfortable, and then things go wrong in many different ways. And as I say, I like the idea of it continuing beyond that and seeing how he responded to the rest of that roller coaster ride of the Bolshevik Revolution. But sadly, we didn't get that opportunity.
Maybe I'm just lamenting my own social skills that I can't roll into a country and within a month just have this gang of friends and lovers and all this stuff. I'd probably still be in the hotel room just crying myself to sleep every night.
Well, some of it does reflect, as I say, the actual way that the show, the making of the show happened. But also, don't forget that wonderful movie that Warren Beatty made, Reds. Do you remember that movie?
Come to New York. What as? Huh? What as?
What do you mean, what as?
What as? Your girlfriend?
What does that mean?
What as? Your girlfriend, your mistress, your paramour, your concubine? Just tell me what as.
If you were mine, I wouldn't share you with anybody or anything.
I'd like to see you with your pants off, Mr. Reed.
You're a lying Irish whore from Portland, and you used me to get Jack Reed to marry you.
Why the hell should I care that you slept with somebody else? Do you think I haven't?
Who?
What do you mean, who?
Who was it?
Who was what?
And that gave you a feeling of the intensity of the emotional relationships that came up in the midst of revolution, that so much was going on, that people were kind of flung together, and romance blossomed and friendships blossomed and were betrayed, in a pressure cooker of emotion. And that was what I think we were aiming to convey.
I love that group of friends, and that story, actually, I came across your novelization when I was junior high, perhaps, very young, before I saw it, and I actually didn't see it for many years. And I remember both in the story and then in the episode, that group of friends, it feels really believable and grounded, and it feels like a group of college friends, and because they were all together physically, they were sharing this home, they all have very different beliefs, very different personalities. And yet they've all found something in common. They have a friendship that works in spite of all that. And that perhaps is the optimism of your episode, which is that these people of different views can be friends, and that it is the forces of the state and these other forces that are sort of trying to drive them apart, but they can choose to stay together. And I don't, you don't see that a lot. And none of the characters have to change their beliefs to have that connection, which is, I think, really beautiful.
I think that was partly influenced for me. It came out of a year I spent in the jungles of Borneo when I was 17. I was a volunteer teacher in a jungle school. And in that same neck of the woods, I mean, there were headhunters, there were, it was quite a wild part of the world, but there were Peace Corps volunteers. Now, they were all a bit older than me because they were university graduates. I was a high school graduate. But they, when we came across each other, in our travels, they were always really friendly and supportive. They were like big brothers and sisters to me. And so some of that friendship circle that is reflected in the Petrograd episode comes out of my experience of being with Peace Corps volunteers in Borneo in 1968.
Well, if you were 17 in the jungles of Borneo, I think a little more of the show perhaps comes from your life experience than just that situation.
I've had the odd adventure.
Well, I see you're back from your little adventure.
I'm curious from a writer's perspective. It sounds like the writing experience was so positive, and it's so welcoming and nurturing of a process. And then being on set, it sounds like such an adventure there too. And then the show comes out March of 1992, truncated first season, but gets some good response. But I wonder, as a writer, like how are you interpreting the reviews for the show? How are you interpreting the audience base? Like what was the sense for you and for the writers' room as a whole?
Well, I think we were. I mean, particularly from my point of view, I was absolutely delighted to see my work on the air. Gradually, I think we all began to realise that the show was not being given its right promotion and right airtime. I think the feeling was that the networks. I mean, George had managed to get it so that he could make what he wanted. Essentially, if he stuck within the budget, he could make what he wanted, and I think he had the feeling, we did, that the shows with lots of explosions were the ones that the network wanted. And the shows which had philosophy and Albert Schweitzer and things like that was not what they wanted. And so they put their money down for this. They did get Young Indiana Jones. They did have amazing, production value on screen. But some of it was people talking philosophy.
God. The unmoved mover, the prime cause. God dances beyond the bounds of logic.
But certainly it means something to you whether your work is put to the use of good or evil.
The Germans think they represent the good, and the French are evil. I'm a scientist, not a philosopher.
And, thinking about moral issues and things like that. And they wanted Indiana Jones being chased by the natives, And crazy, we moved well beyond that. And we were doing something which had serious intent, and I don't think the networks really wanted the serious intent. I think there were times, I recall rightly, in the New York marketplace where it was being shown at 10 p.m. at night, for a show that was designed for families to sit down and watch together. And so we did feel and I'm pretty sure George felt, this show is not being given the kind of airtime that it deserves, and that he'd made it to give people something to make their lives richer, and it does that too. Don't forget, in those days, you couldn't say, well, look at the DVD. We went out on the air and vanished.
Yeah,
exactly. There was no reruns there, or if there were, the reruns would be in the AM.
Exactly.
Of another,
and so it was, to be honest, frustrating that although the show got good reviews, although people loved it, they were not being given the chance to see it in a way the times were shifted around in different marketplaces. It didn't become part of family viewing, which relies partly on regularity. You sit down at think of Doctor Who. I always remember growing up with Doctor Who in Britain because it was a 6 p.m. Saturday show. So you always knew when it was going to be on. So it became a family event to sit down. And Young Indy could have been like that had the networks taken it more seriously and not said, well, there aren't enough explosions. We're not going to really put our backs into it.
It feels like he missed, with television, he wasn't able to control the distribution the way he could with film, with the theaters, with Star Wars. And even later, I think when he did do the Clone Wars on the Cartoon Network, I think he was very savvy in negotiating his terms on that deal, which probably because he learned from this situation of what happened with the network.
I mean, although there's a bit of a tangent here, but I recall the Clone Wars even was getting this weird AM distribution in some of the seasons.
That was happening later. But early on, I remember when it premiered, I believe it was Friday night, which isn't a great night, but it is good for kids because kids don't go out Friday night, right? So it was a good time slot, and it was there for a few years, but you are right. They made it a Saturday morning show, maybe later on, and I don't think that's what ended it, though, by the way. That Cartoon Network would have kept that show going forever if not for a certain mouse and a certain purchase.
Anyway, back to Young Indy, though. But I also recall, in the trailer for season 1, the original promos that aired on ABC, there's promotional material for your Barcelona episode, which doesn't even air in season 1. It's held off until season 2 and then put back to back with the Prague episode. So it's interesting how, in some ways, you imagine season 1, maybe from George's and from your perspective as a writer, was meant to be more like that first 15 episodes that you guys broke. And then ABC just truncated it to 6. And we've done episodes in the past about how odd the distribution layout was, how it was clumps of 6 episodes just kind of here and there over the course of a few years. And to your point, many people wouldn't have been able to make it a routine.
Yeah, that's you want it to be destination viewing. It had the potential to be that. I think that potential was wasted by the networks. Yeah.
I want to hear more about the jungles of Borneo. So what other adventures have you had that are inspirations for the series? Did you meet Mata Hari? Tell me, what was your life like?
Well, as a journalist, you do get to meet wonderful people, who have done extraordinary things. And actually, one of the most inspirational people I've ever met was Hergé, who wrote the Tintin books.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And I always remember interviewing him for the BBC, and I made the point as a journalist. I said, you've created in Tintin one of the most famous journalists in history, but he never writes a story. You never see him actually doing the job. And he said, there's an explanation for that. I was hired by a Catholic newspaper in Brussels to write a comic strip about a scout called Tong Tong. And I was given a desk at the back door, in the basement at the back door of the newspaper. And through that back door, all the reporters for the newspaper used to come. They used to come and go. They'd arrive, they'd set off, because the cab would meet them outside in the alley, and off they'd go on their adventures. And I thought, these are great characters. I love what they do. Look at their suitcases covered in stickers and their, the things they stick in their hats and so on. And so I decided to turn Tong Tong into Tintin, the journalist, but I had no idea what journalists actually did apart from come and go. That's what Tintin really does. So there is a certain similarity between Tintin and the Adventures of Tintin and the Adventures of Indiana Jones. And so, having had the opportunity to get to know Hergé, that was a perfect example of how my journalism fed into my work for Young Indiana.
Now, am I right in saying, I know sometimes this is a ghostwrite kind of situation, but did you also write the novelizations for your episode?
Well, yes. Yeah, the one that you mentioned, Danny, that you read, that was me, and I was able to write the novelization of Small Soldiers, and because I write novels, it comes sort of naturally to put it into proper prose. Yeah.
How do you find that process, especially with a TV show, and all that kind of stuff?
It's in some ways the limitations imposed on you by the publishers of novelizations are, that it's not like, I'd love to do a novelization. I'd much prefer it when I come up with the idea and I'm able to, create the novel from the ground up. Which is what I'm doing at present with a series of novels that began with the Age of Treachery. It's a series of novels that begin in the just after World War II is finished, with a former Special Operations Executive Officer who has amazingly become an archaeologist. In fact, he was an archaeologist before the war. He's a classical historian, not an Indiana Jones style one, but he was an archaeologist before the war. He went and joined the Special Operations Executive. He returns hoping for peace and quiet in Oxford, and finds himself drawn into the world of what basically the creation of our world as it happened after World War II. And there's not a lot of material about that, and yet that's when the Iron Curtain was put up. That's when the bomb became part of our politics as well as the military reality.
Chapter 1. 3 Lumps of Coal. 13th of January, 1946. He felt again the peculiar gliding sensation as the knife passed through the cartilage of the sentry's throat. He smelt the youth's skin as he gripped him, and then the warmth of the blood as it poured over his fingers, and the body slid down to his feet, looking up at him with mildly reproachful eyes. Forrester guessed he was about 17. As the sentry died, Forrester could see through the archway leading to the castle courtyard SS guards taking the prisoners into the basement. There were many such images. He let them unreel at their own speed.
And so I've been writing this series of novels, starting with The Age of Treachery, about how someone is involved in shaping the world we live in today. Because just as George was starting in before World War I and saying, how did the events of World War I come to shape our world today? I was doing the same thing, started with World War II, or just after the end of World War II. I'm now up to 1952. Where I'm writing about what happened during the American presidential election of 1952. Where, interestingly, the man who was going to run as the Democratic candidate was Harry Truman, not dissimilar to Biden today. He dropped out in January 1952. The man who was going to be the Republican candidate was Robert Taft, son of the former president, who was determined that America should abandon Europe to its fate. And of course, he didn't become the candidate. Eisenhower became the candidate, and the relationship between Europe and America remained strong. So there are fascinating historical parallels between the recent past and where we are today.
It's all a flat circle, right? Isn't that what they say? It's just...
That's a good phrase. What goes around comes around.
That's better. I like that better. Yeah. You're doing it in your own books, but, you know, the character of Indiana Jones, I like to think that if George had stayed with the franchise, that you would have seen something similar with World War II, and you've gotten a little more sense of the history and, you know, how things played out, because that character is so rich and maps so well to the development of, you know, the 20th century history, you know, being born in around 1900, and then, you know, kind of being not quite old enough to fight in the First World War, but we'll get him there, right? And then, you know, being maybe just a little too old to fight in the Second, but we'll get him there, you know, and on we go. There's a lot of opportunity, and certainly it's an underutilized character in terms of what you could do with him. And exploring these ideas, and what you guys were able to do with the show, as you say, tackling these topics and these ideas. You know, I like to think a good television show, certainly a drama, can use its platform to grow and evolve and encompass a number of different kinds of things, right? It shouldn't just be the same thing all the time. Young Indy does that. There are other shows that do that, but it's a shame that it sort of has stopped. You know, I really would love to see real investment in the character and the franchise, and what you guys were able to do, you know, as a group and develop this thing. Like, that could be done again. You know, They don't need to be afraid, but you need to invest in talent, in people like you, and people who are educated and have diversity of experiences, life experiences. I mean, I love that you say that, you know, you came to this as a second career when you were about 40, which I'm getting there. I'm getting very close. And, you know, you do get some of that experience. You have some of that life that you can draw on, and you have something to say, frankly, you know, to people because of how you've lived. And it's something I admire and I really appreciate. And, you know, thank you for what you contributed to this series, which has had just an effect on me and how I think. And, you know, when I encountered the series in high school, there were things about it like the Schweitzer morality speech, which we've talked about on the show.
Thinking man gives every life the same reverence that he gives his own.
Good is that which promotes life, evil that is to destroy it, that I struggled with. I mean, I was coming of age around the time of the Second Iraq War, at a time when war was being promoted, when people were arguing about, just war and there are reasons for war. And
the war in Iraq 20 years later, the stated objective to remove Saddam Hussein, free his people from dictatorship, and destroy alleged weapons of mass destruction. At first, more than 70% of Americans supported it, but that waned as the mission became mired in controversy, eventually falling to just 32%. Saddam was eventually captured 9 months into the invasion, but the war raged on for 8 years, killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians and more than 4,000 U.S. military forces. Weapons of mass destruction were never found.
Don't you remember what Dr. Schweitzer said? Good is that which promotes life. Evil is that which destroys it.
And so I came up against that philosophy and I questioned it. I was like, well, that doesn't seem, but you watch the show and you wrestle with it. And as I've gotten older, as I have gotten maybe a little cynical or lost some of that naivete and seeing things, these ideas, they sort of become they're more focused. I focus in on them more. I see them more clearly. And I'm like, oh, that was right. That was there. I heard it. But now I see, as all the things fall away and things turn to ash, that idea is really strong. That idea is something that can last, that can adapt to different situations and different problems, right? Complicated problems, complicated situations that you face and you don't know. But these are some really strong principles. So if you guys did all that in a room with a fireplace and smoking cigarettes or whatever you were doing, thank you and good for you guys,
Well, thank you for those words of appreciation. It's lovely to know that the show had an impact. I mean, I gathered that from talking to people over the years, but it's very nice to hear it articulated so well by you both, and I really appreciate that. And I also utterly endorse your idea that if we could do something like that again, so that we take a character and have that character respond to the events of our time and of the recent past in a way that helps us think more clearly about the decisions we have to make all the time. That would be a wonderful and worthwhile thing. And if anybody's thinking of producing such a thing, I for one, would be very much up for it.
All right, Peter, you got to go produce it.
Yes.
So you've been very kind with your time here, and I don't want to keep you for too much longer. But one lingering question I'd love to put to you is, we look at the trajectory of the show, and we see it, and you've talked about the story break sessions, how there'd be the first one, which seemed to encompass most of the first half of the second season, kind of the first 15, and then there'd be a few others in London and so forth. Did the story break sessions go well into season 3, or do you recall about how many episodes did you have broken and potentially even written before the cancellation came?
I'll be honest, it all becomes a bit of a blur.
Understandable.
It's the things I could probably consult diaries and things like that, but overall, it's the highlights of the experience that stick with you. The kind of, I'll be honest with you, a kind of warm glow when I think about it all, rather than, this was a bad moment or this stopped there. No, it was just, this is a privilege to be involved with. It was wonderful. I have very happy memories of it. There are scripts I would have liked to seen made, obviously. There was a particular one about the founder of the Red Cross, a wonderful story, that a sort of tragic tale of the man who created the Red Cross and but at one point in his life was literally a tramp on the streets of Paris, completely forgotten. And he was the guy who created this wonderful organization that saved so many lives. It was a tragic and uplifting story at the same time. And I really regret that wasn't made. But having said that, the fact that so much was made and that it was such fun making it, that's what I remember.
Wonderful. Do you recall, just really quick, was that going to be a young toddler indie, or was that a teenage indie story there?
I think it must have been the Young Indy because of if I recall rightly, the Young Indy met this old man and learnt his story. I think that was the way we told it, and it had to be the Young Indy because of the time period that the chap died. Before 1910, so to speak, not before 1910, before 1920. Yeah.
Right. Gotcha. Wonderful.
It's beautiful.
Well, I mean, you talked about it a little earlier on, but do you have any other current projects you want to talk about? You want to promote here on the show?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of things going on. I've just had the great privilege of writing with my daughter, actually, Rebecca Scott, who is also a writer and television director, a series called One Bad Apple, about an American girl who turns up at a British boarding school and proceeds to take it over. And then she takes over the local village, market town as well. And we gradually realize the reason that she has this extraordinary power over people is because she is the daughter of the devil. And the devil, who, as we know, was forced into exile from the world eons ago, but is hanging around on the edge of the cosmos, gradually coming closer to re-establish his dominion. But there are certain artifacts that are buried around this area of the English countryside which are preventing him from returning to Earth. And the reason that his daughter, who is... I mean, imagine that her mother is someone who sells extraordinary products at huge prices on the internet. You think, why would anyone buy this strange egg or this strange, thing that you put on your face? Except she has had a liaison with the devil and produced this daughter. And the devil now wants this girl to find these artifacts, destroy them, and enable him to return and take over the Earth. By amazing coincidence, it turns out that one of the girls at the school is the last in the line. She's a scholarship girl. It turns out she's the last in the line of people whose job it has been over the centuries to protect these artifacts. So you have two teenage girls who neither of them knows the girl Mercy doesn't realize she's the devil's daughter at the beginning, and the girl Lydia, whose job it is to protect the artifacts, doesn't know that either. So you have two teenage girls in high school who are at each other's throats and gradually realize that their battle is not just between teenage girls, but it has cosmic significance. So that's One Bad Apple. It was backed by Germany's ZDF. And they are seeking another partner for the show. And if we can get that partner involved, then we could get to make the story of the battle between the devil and his daughter for control of the Earth. Wow. So keep your fingers crossed for that one. One Bad Apple.
Well, I love that in the fine tradition of British literature that the heart and soul of the universe will be fought in the British countryside. So.
Absolutely. And in the British public school, even better.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, wow. That's wonderful. I love that so much. Well, you've been so kind with your time. I suppose we should let you go here. But if I know you have a website, would you have any other resources you'd like to tell fans about?
That's probably, yes. I suppose www.gavinscott.co will find my website, and then and the books that I'm publishing are available on Amazon. If you start with Age of Treachery, then the others will appear. But that's an easy title to remember. And I welcome interaction with people who've liked my stuff over the years, and I plan to continue producing it.
Gavin, I just have to say, your strength of personality is incredible. I will always remember this conversation because, you are a force. And I can tell you're a journalist because when we started talking, I thought to myself, this man is in charge of this conversation. There is nothing I can do. This is his show now. That's how it's like I've just been in awe of you the whole time. So thank you so much for bringing that energy to our show.
Thank you so much. But I do want to say that you guys have been excellent interlocutors. So it has been a pleasure hearing your questions and responding to you both. So thank you. Thank you from here in Santa Monica. I've really enjoyed this.
That's wonderful. And thank you, the audience out there, for tuning in today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can find us at Young Indy Pod on Instagram, as well as just search up for the Young Indy Chroniclers on YouTube. And so until next time, for Daniel and myself, thanks very much for being here, and keep on adventuring.
I said to the almond tree, Sister, speak to me of God. And the almond tree blossomed.
Next time on the Young Indy Chroniclers.
We're thrilled to have Joel Selbo, one of the writers of the series.
He said, well, I'd like you to join the writing staff. I would really like to, but just had a baby. He says, I'm one of the best employers for young mothers. Now, George's whole career, he's just absolutely had a vision for what he wanted to do, and he did it. What really gets to me now is how different it is from present day television. What's chosen to be produced. And watching them so fresh, I was just like, oh my God.